One of the things that did raise everyone's mood was that Karen was immediately supportive of John. She'd been a friend before all this had happened, and she now made it her aim to help raise him out of his depression. Karen became a good friend and a member of the Moselstraat extended family. They had been sitting in a local cafe in the centre of Tavern when she had first heard the truth of what had happened. "Theft," she said with a tone of disbelief, directing her comments towards John. "He accused you of theft. What was he stealing from the choir? Is the man mad?" she said in a distinctive German accent. Karen was always direct with her opinions. She was in her late 50s, divorced, and had brought up 3 children who were grown with their own families. She was living on her own and was determined to enjoy life. She drank too much, her doctor told her. She couldn't smoke either. She should lose weight and take more exercise. All this John had told her about, and all this Karen had suitably ignored. Her argument was that, now free of what she called that cheating bastard, as she always referred to her ex-husband, was not about to be told how to live her life by another man. She had money, she had family, and she had friends. That was all she needed. She didn't need another man. She didn't need another relationship, and she was happy with the life she had now. Karen had experienced an interesting life. She had been born in Germany in the last year of the war. Germany had lost, Hitler was dead, and in her first few months, she and her mother and her grandmother had to flee their home as the Russian army advanced. Luckily, they had made it to the British sector where the Allied armies were taking the remains of Germany. Her grandmother had family in northern Germany, so they took refuge with them. Her father had been in the Luftwaffe and had survived the war as a pilot. Karen always maintained that she and her family were never Nazis. In fact, she came from an aristocratic family who generally did not approve of Adolf Hitler, referring to him as that upstart or not representing German values. This, though, was not a subject that she wanted to talk about. It was in the past, and Karen sincerely believed in living in the present. In those days, she would often visit the house when she was bored, or simply passing the house to visit her daughter. She had a way with Wotan as well. He was always excited to see her, but being a large dog, he would start bouncing around the house, which meant he would knock into things. And more than once he had broken a vase or nearly knocked someone over. Karen, though, would have none of this. "Wotan," she would say in a firm German accent. "Sit." Without hesitation he would stop, sit, and then look up to her as if wanting for a treat. He was being a good dog, after all. Karen always had a treat for him. Like she always brought wine or food with her, there was always a treat for Wotan in her bag. Kurt didn't approve and said that she was spoiling him. Karen would smile and ignore him. "I have treats for you as well," she would say, and hand Kurt a bottle of wine. "Open this for me, darling," she would say with a smile, and start emptying a few other things from her shopping bag. Karen was part of the family and had different kinds of relationships with each of them. With Kurt, she would often speak Dutch, and even sometimes German, although Kurt recognized that his German wasn't fluent. With John, it was his love of music which binded them. She had a mixed collection of CDs from classical music to Queen and ABBA. With Max, she had another type of relationship. She accepted that Kurt and John were a couple. But where did Max fit into this? Was he gay as well? Max just smiled at the suggestion. He was beginning to wonder himself. Their friendship was based on his interest in history and her past in Germany. They had made plans at one time for him to write her memoirs in English. Karen wanted to do this, but thought her English was not fluent enough, and sometimes she would find it easier to explain herself in German. Max could help her write her story in English. Karen was also an amateur artist, and for Max he thought she was rather good at it. She always used watercolors, and some of her still lifes of flowers and the countryside were good. She had even exhibited some of her paintings in local shops, but never had she thought of doing it professionally. The four of them were spending more and more time together. Karen would invite them around to her apartment to prepare a meal. They were a strange mix of friends that perhaps other people wouldn't understand, but they did. They were free to make their own decisions without interrupting or questioning or criticizing them. The truth was simple. They just enjoyed each other's company. Karen would say that she had never laughed as much as when she was with them. There was one problem that was beginning to show itself. John was drinking now constantly. Still not hard liquor, but he would start drinking beer as soon as he got out of bed, and then he would be drinking throughout the day. He was still taking antidepressants, the one thing that should really not go together. And he didn't realize the amounts of pills and medication that he was taking. He wasn't just visiting one doctor, his own doctor, but he had found other doctors in the area who were prepared to provide him with a variety of medications. Some were antidepressants, some were painkillers, others were designed to get him high. Together with the amount of alcohol he was drinking, this made his mood difficult to predict. He would be happy and laughing one moment, and then he would be in a rage a few minutes later. He would say things that were strange and offensive, especially if he thought he was being criticized or was being put under pressure. He would consume pills as though they were sweets and then wash them down with another beer. When Max ever questioned this, he was told that it was none of his business. Kurt had even talked to his doctor about the amount of medication John was taking, and also told by the doctor that it was none of his business. So both Kurt and Max found that they were getting more and more concerned about John, but there was nothing that they could do about it. Karen even noticed, and at one time had banned John from her apartment when he had been there and had started swearing at her for no apparent reason. It was in John's nature, though, that after one of his outbursts, the following day he would act as if nothing had happened. He would be back to his usual jovial self. He never apologized. He would simply be everyone's friend again. Even with Karen, he would be banned one day from her place, and then the following day he would be there again at her door with a bottle of wine, and they would be friends again. Karen wasn't fooled by this for 1 second. She had lived a life and had known people like this before, so she was prepared to forgive and forget, but not to accept it. John's behavior, though, did start affecting the atmosphere in the house. Kurt had become more withdrawn and would spend more time playing his computer games. Max was okay with it, but could tell when John was becoming agitated and would withdraw into his own bedroom with the excuse that he was going to read a book. John was never violent during these episodes. He realized he wouldn't be allowed to get away with it, especially with 2 other grown men in the house. He was never abusive to Wotan, but his rages did worry the dog, who would spend time in the garden rather than going into the house. Max was forgiving because he knew that this was not the real John. He had asked John to cut out the drinking and go to see his doctor. John had refused and told everyone that there was nothing wrong with him. It was clear to everyone that what had happened with the choir was still upsetting him, and as such, they were prepared to forgive his unacceptable behavior. Other people who visited the house would also receive a raging rant from him, to the extent that some stopped coming and others would leave hurriedly as soon as his actions and words became unbearable. John was losing friends who had known him for years. John was ill, but there was nothing anyone could do about it. They wanted to. They could see what was happening to him, but John was not listening. He had become obsessed with himself and would not look for any help. John didn't think that anything was wrong, but there was something wrong with him. He was descending into a hell of his own making. He was falling apart. For Max, it was difficult to watch and to live in the same house with him. He had thought about moving out. He had made a promise to John that he would never leave him. Now, when John was at his most vulnerable, he could not break his promise and leave him to deal with his demons on his own. Max decided there and then that he would stay. John needed him now more than anything else. Max had travelled over to England that Christmas to see his father. He had no reason now to visit Birmingham, as Jane had moved on and was in another relationship, and the house had been sold. His father was aging, but was still in good health. They had not been together for a number of years and had phoned each other regularly, especially since his stepmother had died a couple of years ago. His father lived in a protected housing complex in the north of England. He was in a modern 2-bedroom apartment where he took care of himself. He was surrounded, though, by other retired people, and there was a good community atmosphere. There was a warden, too, on site, who looked after them, and there was even an emergency cord in each room that could be called if there was an emergency or the residents needed help. His father was happy, even though now he was on his own and enjoyed being part of a community. Max also liked the place. It was small, but then again, he was only visiting his father, and he sort of felt at home. They had used the Christmas holidays to visit various relatives around the area, as his father still had his car. He preferred Max to drive while he was visiting, but this was no real problem. It would be later that his father would give up driving altogether, but for now, while he was still healthy, he used the car to get around. They had enjoyed the Christmas holidays together, and Max had never really thought much about leaving his house in Moselstride and was enjoying being back in the old country. Kurt had told him that he would be spending a couple of days away for Christmas without John. He was going to a family event in another part of Belgium, and his family didn't really approve of his same-sex relationship with John. His brothers and sisters were okay with it and had never thought much about it. It was the younger generation who were more open to different lifestyles, even if it involved their brother. The older generation were different, though, and showed their opposition. They didn't accept John and made it obvious in the past that he wasn't really welcome. They would make it clear by only speaking Dutch while John was around, and would refuse to speak English, although John knew too well that they all spoke perfect English. Also, Kurt was concerned about John's behavior. This was going to be a special family event for his grandparents, and given John's recent drinking and aggression, he was afraid he might get into a rage and spoil the party for the rest of the family. It was not a chance he was going to take, and made it clear to John that he wasn't invited and that he was going alone. Surprisingly, John had accepted this and had assured Kurt that he and Wotan would be fine, alone together in the house for a few days. It was a couple of days after Christmas when Max received a phone call from at his father's apartment. It was Kurt. Max was slightly confused, as Kurt had called this number in England when he knew that he would be flying home in a couple of days. John has fallen, he explained in a quiet voice. He's in hospital. Max was concerned and started asking questions. How badly was he hurt? Is he okay? What happened? Kurt tried to explain as best he could, but he would tell him more later when he was back in Belgium. For now, he was on his way to the hospital to see John. He also wanted to talk to his doctors. With that, the call ended. Max was confused and told his father what had happened. His father didn't know either of them, so wasn't greatly interested. They continued their plans for the next couple of days until the time came for Max to go to the airport and catch his plane back. Kurt hadn't called again, so Max was still unsure about what had happened and about how badly John was injured. He had to have to wait until he got back home in Belgium. Kurt was at the airport ready to meet Max. He was watching the arrivals gate at Brussels airport, and eventually Max walked out to meet him. Kurt pulled him over and took him to one of the bars at the side of the airport. John is in hospital, he said, trying to explain. He is in intensive care now. The hospital is looking after him. What happened? Asked Max. John was found at the bottom of the stairs in the basement. Karen found him. She called the ambulance and he was taken straight to the hospital. Why? Max asked. Why was he at the bottom of the stairs? They don't know, Kurt replied. He had already ordered 2 beers and started to drink his. They think he fell. Karen found him. They think that he had been there overnight. There was blood all over the floor. I don't understand, replied Max. Did he fall or something? Yes, he fell, Kurt said. The ambulance was called and they found him. Thankfully, he was still alive, so they took him straight to the hospital. It was Karen who called me. I was still at my parents'. I came over as soon as I could, but they had already taken John to the hospital. I went there, but they couldn't allow me to see him. The doctors were trying to save his life. Max was now stunned. He didn't know what to say. He drank his beer and Kurt was surprisingly calm. He had phoned Max in England, but here he was now collecting him from the airport. Kurt needed him as well. He had always thought that Kurt had been distant from him, perhaps even resentful, but here he was confiding in him. Not any of his Belgian friends or anyone else from his family. Here he was talking to Max and relying on his strength. It was the first time that Kurt had shown any real friendship towards him, but there they were together, facing what tragedy may have happened. Max was strangely moved by this. Kurt needed him. He needed his support. It was something that would now last through the years. Him and Kurt, friends, brothers. They knew that each of them would be there as friends, ready to support each other through whatever life had in store for them. This was something, another strange friendship that Max had formed over the years and that had lasted. Karen found him, said Kurt. She found him in the basement. He talked to her. It was a strange story. She said that Wotan had told her. I'm not sure that I believe her, but she believes it. So, what are you talking about? Asked Max. Wotan told her? You need to speak to Karen. She'll be over later. I asked her to dinner, replied Kurt. It is weird. She can tell you. Max and Kurt finished their drinks and then made their way out of the airport. They sat in silence as Kurt drove them home to Deveren. Wotan was waiting for them. He was quiet. He pulled himself out of his bed in the hallway and came up to Max as he entered the hallway. The house was quiet. It was in semi-darkness. Wotan had a way of showing that he was happy, not like any normal dog jumping around and licking your face as Tosca had done. He was quiet. The way you could tell that he was happy was that his ears went back. Some Great Danes have sticking up ears. Wharton didn't. They fell across his head. When he was excited, he would jump about. When Wharton was happy, really happy, he would look up at you and his ears would rise and go back. When Max entered the house, Wharton looked up at him and his ears went back. Max bent down and stroked his head. "Hi, Wharton," he said. "I hear you've been a hero." Wharton stood there and his ears were still held back. Karen had a strange story to tell. Kurt had heard this from her and wasn't sure that he believed her, but was prepared to give her the benefit of the doubt. She had found John and probably saved his life, but how it came about was different. It was a bit strange. Kurt had prepared a quick meal, and John and Karen had joined them in the house, having brought a customary bottle of wine. As they sat around the dining table in the lounge, she began to tell her story. "I had a doctor's appointment," she started. "Here's in Mosul, just down the road. The appointment was at 10 o'clock, so I was driving past at about 9:30. As I passed, I noticed that Wharton was out of the garden. I could see him at the fence, at the side of the house. He was just standing there, looking over the fence, and he was barking. I just drove past. I didn't think much about it." "So what happened?" asked Max. Wharton was not a natural barking dog. He would occasionally, but Max had never known him bark at the traffic. He just wasn't that kind of dog. Karen continued. "So I went to see the doctor, and I was there for about half an hour. It was just a regular checkup, nothing special," she said. "So I was driving back, and as I passed the house, Wharton was still there at the fence, and as soon as I passed, he started barking again. It was strange. I don't know why. He just seemed right." "Tell Max what happened next," said Kurt, looking over him. "Well, I was driving down the road, and I was about halfway home when I noticed something, and then I suddenly braked hard. The driver behind me, he must have thought I was crazy. I don't know why I did it. I was gripping the wheel, and I was just sitting there at the side of the road with my foot hard down on the brake. Something was wrong. I knew it. I didn't know why, but I just knew it." "That is strange," replied Max, looking at her and then across to Kurt. "Why did you think something was wrong?" "It was Wharton," she said seriously. "He was trying to tell me something. He was calling out to me. I just knew it. So I turned the car around and went back to the house. Wharton was still at the fence, so I pulled up and parked in the drive. I went up to the front house and I rang the bell. I couldn't hear anything inside. I was expecting John to come to the door. I tried again and still nothing. I even looked through the lounge window, but there was nothing." "He could have gone out," said Max, trying to find a reasonable answer. He was intrigued by her story, but wasn't too sure that he believed her completely. However, Karen believed it, and that was all that was important. If he had gone out, he wouldn't have left Wharton out in the garden, would he?" she replied, now slightly annoyed. Kurt nodded. "That's true. So I went around to the side and up to the fence where Wharton was still standing. He was just there looking at me. He let out a bark and was just standing there. So I opened the gate and I let myself into the back garden. He suddenly bolted, ran up to the kitchen door, so I followed him. The door was closed, but it wasn't locked, so I went into the kitchen. Wharton pushed past me and stood looking at the basement door. It was open, and the light, it was on." Karen stopped for a moment and took a drink out of wine. She was beginning to feel emotional as she told the story. You were taking a chance, said Max. Wotan doesn't like strangers in his garden. He would have been difficult. He could have bitten you. Karen looked straight at him, her blue eyes meeting his. Wotan? She said, don't be ridiculous. Wotan would never do anything to me. Karen took another drink from her glass and continued the story. I called out for John, she said, continuing. There was no answer. Nothing. I thought he would answer. Maybe he was in the bathroom. I didn't know. There was nothing. Only Wotan standing there, looking at the basement door. I went down, and I found him there, at the bottom of the stairs, covered in blood. I went down to him, but he wasn't moved. I thought he was dead. She stopped and took another drink of wine. I thought he was dead, Kurt, she said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. So I took my phone, and I called the emergency services. They were here in about 10 minutes. Then they took him to the hospital. But what happened? Asked Max. Had he slipped or just fallen? He was probably drunk. Kurt shook his head. I spoke to the doctor. They think it was a suicide attempt. They found a large amount of alcohol and medication in his system. Max didn't agree. Not suicide, he said. John wouldn't. He had problems, but not suicide. He wouldn't have done it. Not John. I don't know, said Karen. The point is, though, that if Wotan hadn't called out to me, I would have just gone home and he would still be lying there. Kurt nodded. The doctors, they think he had been there all night. Kurt, too, was now showing how emotional he was over the whole incident. He had been there all night, Max. On his own, hardly able to move. He had been there all night on his own. He must have been so frightened that he would die there on the basement floor, all alone. Max leant over and put his hand on Kurt's arm. He's safe now, thanks to Karen. Thanks to Wotan, she said. He saved John. He was the one who called out to me. It was Wotan. I'm sure of that.